What follows might not only be considered a betrayal of epic proportions, but if one were being less charitable, many people might also say that it is downright dishonest and deceitful. As a speculative comment, as many people are commenting and speculating on what's happening, and I'll tell you exactly why I think that or why other people might think that in this video, and you are free to make up your own mind. But what are we talking about? Well, we are talking about the creep of the reversal of Brexit. Now, more thoughts on Brexit in a moment. Some of you may be surprised with how I voted and what my views are, but by the by, you're free to disagree with those as well if you wish. But the more important point here is whether this government and indeed our Chancellor are being honest with us about what they're doing, what their plans are, not least of which compared with their manifesto, but what they're actually doing on a day-to-day basis and what they put out in the press. So for a brutally honest approach to the news and the media, please do subscribe to my channel. I really appreciate that. And also check out my new memberships that I've just launched and revamped. More about those in another video that's down below. But let's take a look at this, shall we? Let's go right back to Brexit. Now, Brexit brought about the end of free movement at the end of the transition period, which was the end of December 2020. So free movement ended, and more about that in just a moment. But these were the results for Brexit. Now, this surprised a lot of people. It surprised me, quite frankly. The turnout surprised me because this turnout was quite a high turnout, considering the turnout for average and standard, even general election voting. But here we are. The turnout was 72%, and the Leave had it by 51.9% to 48.1%. So 17 million people voted to leave. And whether everybody understood or fully understood what that meant is entirely another question. But what it was supposed to do was really to create that divide, to create that separation, which was to end free movement as we saw it at the time, much of which obviously depended on free movement with the EU, etc. More about that as we go along. Now, many of you will be asking, well, how did you vote? Well, I voted to remain, as it happens. Now, that may or may not surprise some of you, because I felt that economically, we would have been much more stable to remain within the EU and to improve things rather than just cut it off, because I think most of us knew that that was probably always going to be a bit of a disaster. And I think many people do think it's been a bit of a disaster. I actually think, on the contrary, I think that it could well have been a success had it been implemented properly and had we really taken control of what we were doing in the UK and really implemented it properly. I think it could have worked. Has it worked? I don't think it has. I think there's a lot of reasons that I think people can point out that it didn't work very well, and one of which is the status of immigration or illegal migration to the UK at the moment. Now, how does that compare with, and how does that come in line with what some people are calling betrayal and deceit and all the rest of it? Well, this is now being dubbed the Brexit betrayal because the return to the EU by stealth. And I'll let you know why I think people are saying this and why it appears that this might be the case. Now, because if we go back to what the Chancellor said and what essentially the government said, she said on behalf of the government, she said that she will always defend British interests. And she's also said quite clearly that there will be no return to free movement, as she's over in Washington having this talk with the G7, the G20 and other parts from the International Monetary Fund. They've been absolutely clear, no return to free movement. What would free movement look like? Well, it would allow people within the UK to move freely into Europe to live and to work without significant restrictions, very broadly speaking, you understand, and vice versa. It would allow people within the EU to move to the UK to live and to work without serious restrictions. That is essentially what we had before, and that's what free movement would look like. Now, again, many people argue that that was a good thing, and I think, with great respect, I think a lot of people voted for Brexit, misunderstanding what that would mean and misunderstanding a lot of what Brexit would mean, and certainly the results of Brexit as we now see them. I think a lot of people misunderstood the full ramifications of it, but there we are. That's what free movement would look like. Now, bearing in mind, and here's why I think there's a betrayal or potential betrayal here. I think other people may think there's a betrayal here. Whilst on the one hand, they say that there's to be no return to free movement, she says she insists that there'll be no return to free movement, and ministers did still want to cut the number of people coming to the UK. So two things they say clearly. They insist that there's no return to free movement, and they still want to cut the number of people coming to the UK. Obviously, those would include illegal migrants, etc. Presumably, I would think. But those discussions will be part of EU reset talks with the rest of the bloc. Now, what on earth is that supposed to mean? Well, they are apparently discussing with colleagues and allies within the EU about what's going on, and there's going to be a summit between the UK and the EU in May, and that summit will be focused on reducing some of the trade barriers that exist between our countries. Now, on the one hand, great, I suppose, if that helps the UK economy to grow or to start growing again. But again, she's insisting that she's bringing down net migration, which has soared massively with over 10,000 this year so far. But again, and I promise you the contradiction is going to come in just a moment, but again, she says that it's non-negotiable that there'll be no return to free movement within the EU, and that these migration numbers would come down. Downing Street reportedly has described this as a red line in any EU deal. And Rachel Reeves has stressed that it's important that we determine who comes into our country and that those things are not up for negotiation. This all reported, when was this? On the 24th of April, only sort of a few days ago. However, here comes the contradiction that may allow people to see this as a huge betrayal and deceit. Read into what you will, but here's what she's reported to have said while she's in Washington and sort of admits something which may well contradict everything we've just said. On the discussion of which is more important, not that I think you can really say one's more important than the other, but on the discussion of which is more important, a deal with the EU or a deal with the US, she's reported to say, well, we've been working very hard this week to get a trade deal with the US. We're working flat out to get a deal with the US and we want to achieve that deal. I don't regard it as either or. However, it's what she says next that might throw a bit of a hint. Now, bearing in mind that before the election, Labour's pledges included that it had no plans for a youth mobility scheme, which would be along the lines of free movement with young people moving to and from other countries and so on. Rachel Reeves then makes a somewhat self-contradictory statement. We're going to bring down net migration and we aren't going to return to freedom of movement. But we're hosting the summit next month. We want to see better trading relationships between our countries, and we do want to enable young people from Europe and the UK to be able to work and travel overseas. But we've got to get the balance right because I don't want to see net migration increasing. I want to see net migration falling. So she sandwiched this very neatly so that later on they can point back to it and say, well, we did say we're going to try to do this, if it works or not, if it pushes numbers up or not. She said it here. Quite clearly, she says we do want to see a better trading relationship between our countries. Fair enough. And she then says to enable young people from Europe and the UK to work and travel overseas. In other words, to come here or to go to Europe. Now, whether you think the free movement is a good thing or not, I know many of you do. I think there are a lot of positives to it. I think there are some drawbacks to it. But whether you think that's a good thing or not is not really the point here. I think the point here is that do we really have an open and transparent government? Because on the one hand, they've said that there's no plans for youth mobility. They want to bring down net migration. There's no return to free movement and etc. That's what they're trying to say to you. But at the same time, whilst they are hinting at what they're working, I mean, whether she meant to say this or not, I don't know. Whether it slipped out, I don't know. Whether it was pre-planned to be a little seed, that little kernel that they can point back to later to say, we did say that before, because this is reminiscent to me of the whole talk on employer national insurance. All the while, you've heard the clips, they said no increase on national insurance, no increase on national insurance, again and again and again. But then eventually they said, yeah, but we didn't say employer national insurance, that's different. But that's still an increase in national insurance. And it was increased, and it has hammered employers. And so it has had a knock-on effects on jobs and so on. So was that the kernel, really, that they could just go back and say, well, we didn't mean that bit? And so now, is this the kernel, the seed that they can point back to say, well, we weren't being dishonest, we did tell you, or we did make it clear that we did want to allow people from the UK and Europe to be able to work and travel and work overseas. So is that their hint? Is that their way of saying that they will allow people to come here to work from Europe? Not saying that that's necessarily a bad thing. Some of you might think it's a bad thing. Some of you don't. That's not the point. I'm not here to disagree with you about that. You're entitled to your views on that. I'm entitled to mine. My personal opinions don't really matter. If you want my personal opinions on lots of things, head over to Black Belt Secrets, my other channel, my sister channel, linked below. I'll give you much more of my opinions there. And again, it doesn't matter whether you agree with my opinions or not. I have some great associates, both here and on X and wherever else that I interact, that love my content, but don't always agree with me on everything. That's because we're adults. We don't always agree on everything. We have an adult discussion about these things. But again, that's not the point. But people are now saying that this is freedom of movement by the back door in any scheme that allows this to happen. And this really is a very subtle way of referencing that this might happen and it might undo what was Brexit. Because remember, we voted for Brexit. Well, I didn't, but many people voted for Brexit. And I happen to think with the referendum going the way that it did, it could have been done in a much better way. It could have been successful. We could have done it properly. But because of the back and forth and the changing people in power and the governments and everything else, I don't think this worked nearly as well, to put it politely, as it could have done. But we are where we are. Now, I think what we probably should do is have another referendum. If we're going down this road, and I would like our government to be open and transparent, I would be happy to be talking positively about our government. If they were open, transparent, tell us what the ideas were, put the ideas on the table, allow the British public to make this vote. If this was an overwhelming vote to rejoin the EU, and let's say again we had a similar turnout of well over 70%, and let's say we had, even if those figures were reversed, even if we only had 51.9% say rejoin, then that would be the referendum. Then we could try to undo everything that we've done. But such as it is, I for one think government should be open and transparent. All the figures should be open. All the, for that matter, court transcripts should be open, because I've recently read that some court transcripts are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of pounds to get hold of court transcripts, because you don't get those for free and you're not allowed to make your own recordings. So then if you want to go for full appeal with every word that was said in court for something that might be successful for appeal, you don't get access to those unless you can afford it. And some people crowdfund it and so on. But I, for one, think that justice and government and everything else should be completely open and transparent, and that's what we should have. Let me know in the comments what you think about that. But if you want my personal opinions on very much more things, head over to Black Belt Secrets. I'm heading towards 200,000 subscribers on there, so clearly some of you want to hear what I think. So thank you for joining me there as well. Thank you for watching and subscribing here, and I'll see you in the next one.